So welcome to tonight's program. This is the first of 3 in our Hope and Healing Grief series. And today we will be talking about anticipatory grief. So we're very glad that you all joined us. My name is Elijah Marquez, and I'm the Community Education Manager at Mission Hospice and Home Care. And I'm very proud to introduce today's event partners. I'd like to take a few minutes to share a little bit about each of these nonprofits, should they be of support to anybody in the room tonight. Kitchen Table Conversations provides education and resources that empower people to have end-of-life planning, advanced care planning, and grief and mourning conversations with loved ones and healthcare providers. And they offer a lot of incredible and free webinars and workshops, which can be found on their website. And I'll be sure to put all of the websites in the chat as soon as I'm done talking. And then our next partner is the California Hospice Network. And this is a strategic partnership committed to sustaining local nonprofit hospices in California. All of our members are working, sharing, and planning together to create stronger community hospices that deliver exceptional patient care and end-of-life services. And our next 3 partners are actually all members of the California Hospice Network. So the first partner is YOLO Cares, and they're a leading provider of hospice, palliative care, grief support, and caregiver resources in the Sacramento Valley. The Center for Loss and Hope, YOLO Care's award-winning grief support program, offers free support groups and workshops to residents of Sacramento, Solano, Colusa, Sutter, and Yolo counties. Our next partner, Mission Hospice and Home Care, is committed to providing compassionate and personalized education, grief support, palliative care, and hospice services. And we serve all members of the San Francisco Peninsula and the South Bay area. And then lastly, Hospice of Santa Cruz County honors the choices of individuals and families by providing end-of-life care and grief support throughout Santa Cruz County. So if you're in any of the locations I just read, I'll throw the links in the chat, and please feel free to use any of these nonprofit resources in any way that you might be able to. And we have 2 facilitators for tonight's program, Garrick Colwell and Christine Kovach. Garrick Colwell is the president and CEO of Kitchen Table Conversations and has been a hospice volunteer since 1987. He is a certified grief educator by David Kessler at grief.com and holds a death and grief studies certification for the Center from Loss and Life Transitions under the direction of Dr. Alan Wolfelt. And Garrick will lead us in the first hour and a half of this program, and he'll be leading the workshop on anticipatory grief. And then our second facilitator, who's also in the room with us, Christine Kovach, is the bereavement manager at Mission Hospice and Home Care. Christine is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in grief and loss, and she has more than 2 decades of experience in hospice social work and grief counseling. And Christine will be closing out tonight's program by leading the group in a 30-minute processing session. And this is an optional group discussion to make space for all of the attendees, just to share any feelings or reactions or emotions that might come up during the workshop. So if you're interested, we hope you stick around for that community discussion. And without further ado, I'm excited to pass over the mic to Garrick to take us away.
Thank you. So it's really very, very special for me to be here this evening. And I thank you so much for us getting together over the course of the months and planning this, and what we've been able to do in our collaboration to come up with this series, a Hope and Healing series. Basically, modeled after Dr. Wolfelt's books, which we're going to talk a little bit about. But the reason this is so special for me is because this is where I began my hospice career, was with Mission Hospice back in 1987. So this is kind of a full circle event for me, an activity to be able to continue to give back to where I began. So thank you all for being here. And my name is Garrick Colwell. I live in Berkheim, Texas, which is a little town north of San Antonio, and co-founder of Kitchen Table Conversations, co-founder with my late wife, Kinslow, and myself. Today is her birthday, would be her 67th birthday. So today is a bit tender for me, reflecting on and just reminiscing and reflecting on her and her time with us together. We'll talk more about that because we certainly had a great deal of anticipatory grief that we engaged in and we're part of during the course of our life together. So what I'm going to do is going to share a little bit. I've got some slides for you and really going to kind of go through those as we talk, but I really want this to be a conversation. Kitchen table conversation was based upon the idea of creating an environment where you can have conversations that are challenging, conversations we don't often have, and trying to make a space in which those conversations can take place with as much grace and ease as possible, knowing full well that the topics we're talking about, end of life, advanced care planning, and tonight in particular, a very specific kind of grief, anticipatory grief, which is not something we talk about typically, but it's something that's an intimate part of our journey in life when it comes to chronic illnesses and as well as terminal illnesses. So that's what we created around the idea of having these conversations. So I wanted you jump in anytime you want. You open your mic, raise your hand. It'd be a great way for us to engage. So just jump in here at any point you like. Even if you're off camera, doesn't matter. You don't have to be on camera, whatever you're most comfortable with. So let me get started by sharing with you a little bit about my background so you have a chance to understand who this talking head is and realize that this collaboration that we have going here between us and there we go. So our topic tonight is expected loss and coping with anticipatory grief. And this is a collaboration between a mission hospice and home care, along with the other people that she talked about, which is just amazing. This expanded into reaching out to such a broad audience. It's been a remarkable collaboration for me. So I wanted to just acknowledge that that's been such a wonderful point for us to be able to work together on. So the idea was to come up was to have what's called a Hope and Healing Grief series, and there are going to be 3 in this series. They're all based on books written by Dr. Wolfelt, who is a grief expert. He's been in private practice for 40 years, and he travels all over the world talking about grief and mourning. He's written over 100 books on the topic, and the 3 of these books here are in the Hope and Healing series, which contains probably a dozen books at this point in time and growing, all on the very specific topics around grief, and mainly topics we don't talk a lot about. So it's giving us some space and some freedom to be able to have these conversations. So I hope if you like what you're hearing tonight, that you'll join us in August as well as in September. This is a little background about me. Been involved in hospice since 1987. I've also served as a volunteer hospice chaplain and hospital chaplain. I'm an end-of-life and advanced care planning educator, a grief support group facilitator and educator. And also I have been honored to be a patient advocate for people who are trying to navigate their way through the healthcare system, which if you are involved in that, you probably understand is quite complex. A certified grief educator, grief support facilitator, certified grief recovery specialist, also certificate in death and grief studies. And my mentors are David Kessler and Dr. Alan Wolfelt. Loss history, I believe this is important to give you, some understanding with the context that I am living my life from. And miscarriages and men oftentimes don't typically go together as topics. So I wanted to make sure to mention it here because it's important that to understand that men's hearts are broken as well, and oftentimes not talked about very much. So there were 7 pregnancies and 5 live births. So there were 2 miscarriages that I experienced in the course of my life. I've been divorced. I come to you tonight as a widower. My late wife's name is Kinslow. Beautiful, profoundly beautiful. You can learn more about her on our website at kitchentableconversations.org in the About Us tab. Also, I'm a bereaved son. My father died 2.5 years ago. And just recently, my former mother-in-law, Edna, died at 95 years old. She was one of the bright lights in my life. Just an amazing, amazing woman. So that's kind of my loss history. That's what I'll be drawing from a little bit tonight and sharing with you some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So what we're going to do to spend our time together is going to talk a little bit about grief as a natural and organic process, the difference between grief and mourning. What is it? And why is that important to understand the distinction? This part is we're going to be doing in the beginning. It's going to be a little bit of grief education. So we have a kind of a common language, the types of losses that we experience, the typical feelings we have around grief, Grief myths and misconceptions. Very interesting conversation around that because there are a lot of them. And we're going to dispel several of them, not every one of them, but some of the major ones I hope will help put some context again or some framework around the conversation when it comes to grief and mourning. How to help a grieving friend. We're going to, Megan Devine is going to visit. Megan Devine's a New York Times bestselling author. She wrote the book, It's Okay, You're Not Okay. And a second book, a journaling book, which is just absolutely brilliant about carrying grief and how it is that you can do that. She's going to talk to us about how we help a grieving friend. And I put this video in here for the purpose of giving you, again, context on how it is that you might reach out and share with your friends on how you want to be treated. So it's a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to grief education. Oftentimes we grieve in character, of course, because that's the way we were taught. But as we grow in our experience, it's also important to understand that as we dispel some of these griefs, myths and misconceptions, we can also start defining how it is we want to be treated as a person who is in grief. Then we're going to talk about, of course, anticipatory grief, components of it, what's the difference between ambiguous loss and anticipatory grief, what causes anticipatory grief, how it's different, how we mourn it, what counts as mourning, and then what the 6 needs of mourning, anticipatory grief are. And some of the detail around that is really important because it gives you some tools that we'll be able to use right away. If you are in a place where you're experiencing anticipatory grief. Then we'll talk a little bit about living, loving, and mourning at the same time. How is that possible? And as the loss happens, after the loss, and then we'll have a final word from Dr. Wolfelt, some very interesting words about hope. But before I get started into the nitty-gritty here of the grief education portion and then in anticipatory grief, I wanted to stop and ask you what brings you here tonight. And you can place this in the chat. Let us know what it is that you want to make sure you walk away with. And you're welcome to raise your hand and share with me as well. But certainly in the chat, let me know what it is that you want to make sure that we cover. Make sure that you say, hey, I really do want to know about this, or I do want to know about that aspect. What's my main intention by being here? And I also have, by the way, a handout for you that we can have sent to you of all the slides, so you don't have to worry about taking notes if you don't want to, because there's some links in here too that you might want to come back to. I'll also post some links in the chat that if you want to keep them, make sure you click on them right away so that they stay with you after the Zoom window closes at the end of our conversation. So you're welcome to join me and just share what it is that you want to accomplish, what do you want to walk away with, or you're welcome to put it in the chat. Need help with grief, Dixie. Okay. Thank you, Dixie. And then when you say I need help, maybe a little bit more about that, if you're willing to share what that means, what kind of grief you might be experiencing, and what your situation might be. And as you think about it and as you write, please feel free to to put it in the chat. So it may not be something that's coming up for you right now, but I know you're interested and you wound up here, and so we'll check the chat as we go, as we continue along as well. So let's get back to slides and say a little bit about grief is a natural organic process. So this is our grief education portion of our conversation. And the reason that is important is because, let me get this black bar out of here. I don't know why it's insisting upon being up there. There we go. So grief is a natural organic process, and Dr. Wolfelt refers to it as the grief and the need to authentically mourn is not an abnormal process, but a natural organic experience that allows us to integrate loss into our lives. It's also something really important to say right up at the front of this is that grief is a spiritual and emotional experience. And while it responds to awareness, it can't be controlled by logic. So grief really is a journey of the heart. It's not a journey of our mind. Our mind can be helpful, but it also can be somewhat cumbersome and difficult. And so that's where the logic doesn't necessarily help us. It's certainly one of those things we have to become aware of, that we can't do this journey through our head. It is something we have to feel our way through as we enter into the wilderness of the wilderness of grief, which is quite inhospitable. So when grief becomes physical, because it's a natural organic process, we feel it. It's a somatic experience. We have a heaviness in our chest, and there are situations where people have died from broken heart syndrome. And you can actually look up what broken heart syndrome is. It's a very real medical condition. It's a reshaping of one of the chambers of the heart due to stress. And people do. I mean, I witnessed this in my own family with the death of my aunt and uncle just a few days apart. They'd been married for 70 years, and neither one of them was about to continue to be on this planet without the other. So it's real and something you might consider. Heaviness in the chest is quite normal and natural part of the grieving process. I know I experienced it after Kinslow died, and it lasted over the course of time, abating over the course of time as well, getting less and less, but it took about a year before it actually completely went away. But if you have the heaviness in your chest, it's recommended that you do see your doctor, make sure that you've eliminated any cardiac issues that you might have. I did that for sure, and it was grief. It was not a cardiac event, it was grief. So it's important to understand that it's very real, it's very somatic, it's very something we feel in our body. We have aches and pains and joints and headaches and stiffness, and it's caused by this overwhelming amount of stress hormone. Because at the end, when not only leading up to someone dying, but afterwards as well, there's just so much anxiety around not only the death, but also about our future and the fact that we are no longer who we used to be because our loved one is no longer here to help define who we are. Sleeping problems and fatigue because you can't sleep. I mean, it's kind of a vicious cycle. Finding your sleep pattern again may take some time, but it's important to give yourself that time to do what you need to do to find that new rhythm of what your sleep pattern is going to be. So it's important to realize that's part of it and not be too impatient with ourselves. This is a lot about grief, and mourning is about being self-compassionate. One of the biggest challenges when you lose someone is that loss of meaning and purpose, and also embarking on creating a new self-identity. When Kinslow died, I no longer was a husband. I no longer was a caregiver. I had no idea who I was. So I, began that journey almost immediately, because I sat there, of course, and it was like, well, now what? Now who am I? What am I going to do? Because she was such an important part of defining how I defined my life, how I lived my life. So it's important to understand that grief is physical. We feel it, we experience it that way. One of the key points to understand is the difference between grief and mourning. What is it? And grief is the constellation of internal thoughts and feelings we experience when we lose something or someone that we care about. Grief is the weight on the chest, the churning in the gut, and the unspeakable thoughts and feelings. Whereas mourning is the outward expression of our grief. And mourning is crying and journaling and creating artwork and talking to others and telling the story, speaking the unspeakable. Mourning is grief gone public. So it's important to understand that our emotions need motion. It's important that we understand that our emotions need expression. And that's what happens when we mourn, is we express how we're feeling. So people say, well, gee, I just want to grieve. Well, that's important for sure. At some point in time, it's also important to engage in expression. Emotions need motion. You have to feel it in order to begin to heal. So important to understand the distinction that the I in grief stands for what I feel on inside, and the you in mourning reminds me to share my grief with you. Grief must be witnessed, and we'll see a little bit more how that's underscored in our conversations coming up. The different types of losses we experience, there are many. And if you take a look at the grief recovery method and you go to this website, you'll see there's over 40 that cause grief. And these are just a couple of them, or a few of them actually. Death of a loved one, loss of pet, relocation, divorce, estrangement, separation, health issues, miscarriage, and there are many more. So it's important to understand that loss is something we live with every single day in some way or shape or form. And what we're talking about tonight, of course, is loss of a loved one, which is primary and horrific. It's very difficult. the bottom line from David Kessler's point of view is that when the love is real, the loss is real. And so again, there's no right or wrong way to do grief. There's no right or wrong way to grieve and mourn. The best way to grieve and mourn is the way that you feel you need to as you are making your way through this journey, on this journey. Because when the love is real, the loss is real. So typical grief feelings we have: the numbness, shock, confusion, denial, anger, guilt, shame, relief, yearning. These are all normal and natural feelings that we have around grief, around the loss. When initially it happens, we're numb, we're in shock, and oftentimes confused. We walk around in what we call grief fog, grief brain. That's where I realized that, I lost my keys in the house, and somehow I put them in the freezer. I have no idea why. Or walking into a room 3 or 4 times with the intention to do something, but each time not really remembering why I walked into the room in the first place, but I knew I was there to do something. Part of the confusion. And the denial is really important to understand that denial is not just a river in Egypt. It is actually a coping mechanism, a coping tool that we use to help dose ourselves with the reality of the loss. The first reconciliation need of mourning is acknowledge the loss. And sometimes we're just not ready to acknowledge it immediately. It takes time. And over the course of time, The Grieving Brain, a book written by Dr. O'Connor, is important to take a look at that book from the point of view that we are wired. And as we are wired to have this person in our life, we have to understand that we're going to have to rethink and rewire our brain to realize that they're not here, and that takes time. And so denial helps buffer us from the raw, pure grief that is part of our journey, is part of our experience, and over the course of time, in our own way and at our own pace, we come to reconcile and begin to integrate. Anger is an intimate part, and guilt. We'll talk about that in the next 2 sessions that we have coming up in August and September. The shame and relief, certainly part and parcel of what it is to be a caregiver, and also, how it is that we interact with our loved one as they near the end of their life. And yearning, wanting to be with them, not here, but be with them. Doesn't mean that we're suicidal. It just simply means that we are in a place where we want to be, we have this strong urge and need and desire to be with them. So there's a bit of a difference there, or quite a bit of a difference, actually. So typical grief feelings. Grieving people typically experience several feelings at the same time, and their emotions often change from day to day and even moment to moment. There are no stages in grief. They're just simply, I will explain a little bit more about that in a minute, because that's one of the myths that we'll talk about. Grief is love in the face of separation or change. So to love and to live as a human, of course, is to one day grieve. And that's just the reality of how this life works. In general, the stronger your attachment to a person, pet, situation, or thing, the stronger you will grieve when your ties are severed or placed in jeopardy. So let's talk a little bit about myths and misconceptions. Let me check the chat before we do and see what is on people's minds. Do we have any questions on Elijah? So are there questions that you can, Elijah, do you want to share with me any questions you have in the chat?
One of the points that somebody was interested in hearing more about is coming to terms with sorting out the stuff and anticipating stuff that'll be left behind when someone passes. And then the other sharings were all beautiful stories of people just letting us know their own experiences of caregivers and loved ones and anticipating death. And we have a lot of big losses in the room as well. So thank you everyone for sharing that with us.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Yes, the one question about what to do with stuff afterwards is maybe ideally is if this is a situation where your loved one is gone and died, and then you have all the stuff to work with, is it really depends upon what it is that they wanted and what it is that you have responsibility for moving forward with. There's a couple of companies that help, a new company called Artifacts and another company called Empathy. Empathy.com or artifacts.com can both help with helping manage the end after the fact. And ideally, you would have this conversation in advance, and you would already know and have kind of all those things worked out. But oftentimes that's not the case, and we're left with like, what do we do? Um, ideally, we clean our room before we leave the planet, and we have listed and outlined what it is we want done with our stuff. And that's outlined in our last will and testament typically, or it's been communicated, or things have been distributed along the way. But those two companies can help that I'm aware of. Both good companies and solid in what they do.
And then
So
Garrick, we also had two people share the experience of currently being caregivers for one individual with Alzheimer's and another individual with Parkinson's. So if you have any, input that you can give around those two conditions and experiences as well.
yeah. As Carrie, I mean, this is what we'll talk about in anticipatory grief is, so there's more to come on that. And hopefully there's some tips that you'll be able to use, and we'll be able to engage in a conversation around these learnings as well towards the end of our conversation tonight. So stay tuned.
And then the last thing I'll add, because people have mentioned having quite a few losses already in the past, if there's anything that you can, point to or bring up around, is anticipatory grief felt differently when somebody has had experiences of loss already? I think that might resonate with this group as well.
Sure. I think that part of the question comes up for us is that when we have multiple losses, losses in a short succession or over the course of time, or sometimes when we have a loss in our immediate immediately, like now, and we had a loss, several years ago, 5-10 years ago, and we weren't quite finished mourning that loss, then we'll engage in what we call catch-up mourning, and that's something we have to be aware of. There's also a way of dealing with multiple losses that's important to consider, and that is that you can't grieve every loss all at once. And the point is that Dr. Wolfelt wrote this book for that very purpose, called Grief Overload, Too Much Loss, Coping with Grief Overload. And I'm going to put this in the chat for you. So if you want to take a look at the book, you're welcome to, as a tool that you might consider. But the idea is that you need to grieve one loss at a time. And the one loss at a time means that you might need to actually set up kind of a schedule of how you're going to grieve and mourn each loss separately, so that you can give the attention, because every relationship is going to be different, and therefore your interaction with that that loss is going to be different from loss to loss. Like I grieve my dad very differently than my sister does. So there's difference between how we do it in the family, and that, of course, I grieve him differently than I grieve my late mother-in-law or my late wife, because each relationship is different. So I have time, that you set aside for each one, and that gives you full attention to that loss, and satisfies the need to mourn authentically and mourn. So, and this little book is really a powerful little book. It's like $10, and it's about grief overload specifically. So you're welcome to take a look at that as a tool that you might take advantage of. But the essence of it is that you want to set aside specific time. And maybe it's just 10 or 15 minutes on Tuesdays is Dad, and 10 or 15 minutes on Thursdays is Kinslow, and on Saturday, 10 or 15 minutes is going to be devoted to Edna. So that's kind of how I would look at it. And that way it gives me an authentic interaction with each of the losses I've experienced, and gives plenty of time, or whatever time is appropriate during that assigned time or that scheduled time. So it helps takes the overwhelm away from multiple losses, and helps give you some clarity as to how it is that you can manage it. Both, there's a good combination of how you're using your brain as well as using your heart, and allowing yourself to really interact with and meet it where it is. I hope that's helpful. If you want more, if you want to talk about more as we go along, please feel free to jump in here. Okay, so SMS, here we go. So a couple of grief and mourning the same, which we've already talked about. And that's important to just to reinforce that grief is internal and mourning is external. Time heals all wounds, big one. Everybody says, hey, just give it time. Well, it's actually action over time that heals. You have to set the intention to heal. You know, when David Kessler lost his son a few years ago, his young son, David, Diane Gray, another colleague, called him and said she had lost her son, you know, several years before as well. And she said to David, I'm sure you feel like you're sinking. And at some point in time, you might, feel like you're at the bottom. And at some point in time after that, you'll have to decide whether you push off or not. So action over time heals wounds means setting the intention to heal and engaging in activities that allow you to provide a time and attention to embrace, to befriend, to engage in actively mourning the loss. So it's action over time that actually is the truth that heals. Grief is linear, 6 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning. David Kessler added meaning to the 6th stage of grief. He and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the book on grief and grieving. And in that book, they applied her 5 stages of death to the 6 stages of 5 stages of grief. And David added meaning as the 6th stage. But neither one of them ever, in the first page of the books on grief and grieving, they state clearly that this is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. Because grief is messy, the stages are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling. They're not stops on some linear timeline in grief, because grief is not a straight line. Not everybody goes through all of them or in a prescribed order. So it's important for us to understand that it's not as we would hope it to be on the right-hand side, but it's quite messy. It's circuitous. It's recursive. It is something that continues to, we think we're at 6 months and we're doing great, and all of a sudden we have this grief burst. And I was in the grocery store shortly after, well, it was 3 or 4 months, I guess, after Kinslow died, and in the looking at Italian food, was going to make some spaghetti or something, and then all of a sudden this romantic dinner, Italian dinner we had together, flashed through my mind, and it just turned into a puddle in the middle of the grocery aisle. So you never know. And like today, it's been over 4.5 years since Kinslow died, but today would have been her 67th birthday. And this has been a very tender day, a very tender day. A lot of tears and just the reflections. And and last year it wasn't this way, but this year for some reason it is. And I don't know why, but I've kind of quieted my mind and said, I really don't need to know why. What I need to do is feel what I feel. And then underneath that, I find that I come to understand this because of the love. And this is an opportunity to reflect upon that and to engage in that, in understanding and allowing myself to have those feelings. So myth, get over grief, move on. Truth is that we need to integrate and move forward. Integrate and move forward. It's not about getting over and moving on. People oftentimes laugh David Kessler, well, gee, David, I've been grieving for 6 months. How long is that going to be before I'm done with it? And David's response is, well, really the question is, how long will they be dead? Because if they're going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time. And so it's just a natural part of our life. And we begin to integrate it. And as we do begin to integrate it over the time that is right for us, there is no timeline. It's up to you. It's really your journey. And sometimes, people will say, gee whiz, when do your first year is, maybe it's the second year. Sometimes the second year is more challenging than the first year. So everybody's different. But the idea is that at some point, as time passes, we begin to integrate. And at the bottom here, we can see that we actually grow. Our heart is broken, but it's also broken open. And as we come to, navigate our way through this journey, that we're actually becoming more compassionate with ourselves, self-compassionate, and also more compassionate with others. And our heart continues to grow. As we put our patchwork heart back together again, it is bigger than it was before because of the experience that has expanded it through this loss. And this is where we're going to engage Brene Brown for a few minutes. There's a myth that empathy and sympathy are the same. Well, the truth is that empathy fuels connection, feeling with, whereas sympathy drives disconnection, which is feeling for. So I'm going to move to another screen here, and I'm going to share a little video from Brene Brown so you can see what she has to say about it.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So there you have. Very interesting, the idea between the difference between the two. It's important to understand that as we look towards not only how we want to be treated and helping people understand what we're looking for support, but also what it is that we may be able to offer as a result of understanding that too. So, more comments from the chat?
We did have one comment, Garrick, that this video reminded me of. I think it's that at least you know how much time you have left, that sort of thought process that gets pushed onto a lot of people in the space of anticipatory grief. I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure, and how it is we can be betwixt and between, because it's in liminal space that we find ourselves. We find ourselves in that betwixt and between place, and sometimes we are really preoccupied in the future. We're future projecting, and it takes us out of the moment. And there's how do we be present at the same time as understanding that we have those feelings as well. So we're going to talk about that for sure. Okay.
And then this is not a question, but a couple people in this group are currently caregivers to somebody with cancer. So if that's something that you hit on at any point, that might be appreciated as well.
Absolutely. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward here. So this is some information I placed in here. You can come back and look for it. It's the key points that were made in the video that Dr. Teresa Wiseman actually developed, that Brene Brown was talking about, taking someone else's perspective, being non-judgmental, recognizing someone else's emotion, understanding their feelings, and also communicating your understanding of that person's feelings. So I'm going to go ahead and let this video be something you come back and watch on your own. I'm going to put in the chat what the video link is, because it's going to take a chunk of time to cover the rest of this part of it, so we can get right into spend the rest of our time together on anticipatory grief. but it's a great video. It's an important video. Let me stop here and get the video link for you, so that if you want to watch it at another time, you're welcome to do that. And I encourage you to do it because it's really a powerful video. There we go. Okay, so that's the video. Okay, all right. Let me see here. Let's go back to our slides and let's kind of get right into anticipatory grief, so that we can make sure we have time and still end on time, because I want to make sure we're respectful of your time. The essence of the video is that grief must be witnessed, and David Kessler is underscoring at this point that Megan Devine makes in the video is each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. So grief must be witnessed. This is why support groups are such an important part. Individual counseling is such an important part of the tools that we have to grieve and mourn. So let's talk about anticipatory grief. Grief, what is it? It's grief is the inner experience of loss. Then anticipatory grief is the inner experience of expected loss. It's just an aspect of loss that we're experiencing. Now, in this case, we're aware of a pending loss. And I can share with you a little bit about our journey, kind of frame some of this a little bit. If someone you love is dying, you will naturally begin to anticipate their eventual death. And so on November the 1st of 2014, Kinslow and I were married after a year of courting. And then 22 days later, she received a stage 4 metastatic melanoma diagnosis with less than 6 months to live. So 22 days, we were married, happily, blissfully, getting ready to go and take a trip, but we spent our honeymoon at MD Anderson. And so our anticipatory grief journey began that day, and that proceeded to be part of our lives, an intimate part of our lives, until her death, which was 4 years, 3 weeks, and 2 weeks, 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks later, on February 12th of 2019. So anticipatory grief was something we had all these plans. She was, of course, starting to change physically shortly thereafter. I mean, within a couple of weeks, it became apparent what the issues were. And so, she was changing. Our life had changed completely. Our dreams had been totally shattered. And it's what we're going to do the rest of our lives, working together. She was a licensed marriage and family therapist, and we loved working together and group facilitation. And she was brilliant. I mean, I kind of was along because I wanted to learn, but she was absolutely phenomenal at this. So all that stuff went away, and we had to deal with the reality of what was taking place. But so that's the context in which I'm sharing with you. You'll likely feel many of the grief feelings listed before as you witness your journey, their journey, and the changes they're undergoing, as well as consider the many what ifs and what's next, including imagine your life after the death. And that's the part where you have a question about, well, gee whiz, how can I possibly be thinking about my life after they're gone? But in fact, that's all part of the journey with anticipatory grief. So what are the components? Well, two major components in anticipatory grief are process. The process of living through the chaos, and process of living through the change, which happens, the closer you get, the longer you are engaged with, as a caregiver, or being in the position of loving someone who is dying of an illness that's long-term or short-term. You have time, and in that time, you're in this change. It's always changing. Yeah, every day is a different day for sure. And then there's the tendency to project ourselves forward in time, partly because we understand the truth that they're not going to be there. The other part of it is that we're going to be here. So what does our life look like? Its natural tendency to do that is to look forward. A little bit about ambiguous loss versus anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is when you find yourself grieving in loss circumstances that don't have a clear endpoint. This is ambiguous loss, I'm sorry. So it doesn't have a definite endpoint or a clear endpoint or status. Whereas anticipatory loss is the inner experience of expected loss, as we mentioned before. So sometimes ambiguous loss comes up because it's a long time that you're involved, and it may feel ambiguous because it hasn't a clear endpoint or status. Anticipatory grief is just you're expecting the loss. So sometimes it has to do just with time as far as as far as what you feel and what the overlap is. And that's just more of semantics than it is anything else, because the majority of what we're talking about tonight is anticipatory grief. And here's an example of the two and how they overlap. It says, if a loved one struggles with a long-term addiction and is in and out of sobriety, you may be living with anticipatory grief, grieving the process and projecting possible death and ruin. Yet there are many, may never be a climactic resolution of any kind. So that's something just to keep in mind and how it shows up. Causes of anticipatory grief: terminal illness and life-threatening illness, you or someone else. Absolutely. Dementia, aging, long-term illness, divorce, pending major medical procedures. Right now, we're experiencing anticipatory grief. My girlfriend's daughter, 37-year-old woman who has 2 young children, has been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and won't have surgery until next Tuesday when we find out what type. And so the family is now in anticipatory grief as to what it might mean. Naturally, we're worried and concerned. So there's an aspect of it that we're experiencing here in this household. So upcoming major life transitions also anticipate a move, anticipate a promotion. I mean, that's all part of some of the feelings you may have about leaving your old home or leaving your own position. So how is anticipatory grief different? Typically begins during a period of change or chaotic and unpredictable time in your life. You're likely to experience heightened emotions, ferocious protectiveness, surprisingly torn or ambivalent. You may wish for it to be over. And that's not, these are all normal and natural expressions of anticipatory grief. You may have heightened guilt. Imagine your own future after the loss. It's called joy guilt, because you're happy. Hopeful feelings might then make you feel guilty, which is normal, a very normal feature of anticipatory grief. The in-between time is granted to both a privilege and a hardship. So you have knowledge, as it were, to some extent, that there is a loss pending. And so this is kind of golden time versus someone who suffers the loss of someone who has abruptly died in an accident or cardiac event or something of that nature, where it just happens abruptly, or there's a diagnosis and that person is gone within a week or 2 weeks, or they have a stroke and they're gone. So we had this, and I can tell you from personal experience, we had this, time where we were in between, of course, and it was very up and down in relationship to the fact that, we finally understood there was an end coming, but there is also this beautiful time of just being present with each other and just cherishing and one another and cherishing that time that we had together. So the opportunity to spend the final weeks and a month at their side is precious time that people who suffer the sudden loss of a loved one don't have. Sudden loss often precludes the suffering of both the person who is dying and their loved ones, as well as all the pain of uncertainty along the way. So here's, a little bit more about how that works. So how is it that you mourn anticipatory grief? Again, grief is internal. Grief is hidden, mourning is visible. Mourning is expressing our grief on the outside. It applies here with anticipatory grief. Mourning is grief gone public. It's grief in motion, and emotions need motion. It's that quality of momentum that makes it so powerful and actually moves us towards healing. That's how healing begins, is by moving our grief into mourning. So mourning is how we integrate the grief into your life and continue to live and love even as you're grieving. And over time, especially after the loss you're expecting reaches its endpoint, mourning is now how you come to reconcile your grief and heal. So mourning is an important part. So what does count as mourning? Talking with someone else. As I mentioned earlier, grief must be witnessed. David Kessler points this out in that quote I just read you, and it's not to be judged. So you're looking for people who will actually be with you, and realizing that at the time, whether you're in anticipatory grief, and this happened to us as well, or you are after the loss, is that friends become strangers and strangers become friends. So, and that's just part of the journey. Some people are just not able to be with you and witness your grief without feeling uncomfortable. And somehow, although it seems so odd that when we're in such a need of support, that others who we think know us aren't able to provide it. And it has nothing to do with us. It has to do with they're just not able to be present with the high emotions and the changes that they've witnessed in you. And the fact that if we start talking about the loss that you've suffered, I'm starting to come to terms now and facing my own mortality. And after all, we live in a generation at a time when people believe that death is an option. But the last time I checked the mortality rate of the United States, the mortality rate in the United States is still trending at 100%. So we're not going to get out of here alive, but that just takes time for some people to come to terms with. Some people don't come to terms with it. And so strangers become friends and friends become strangers as part of the journey. But as you're looking for your grief to be witnessed, you're looking for a place where you're not going to be judged and that you can just find your way by being heard. Crying is another way of mourning. Tears are evidence of love. David Kessler. These are the different kinds of tears that we have. Number 3 is emotions, rid our body of stress chemicals and help us cope with high emotions, sad or happy. Those emotional tears do good mourning work. So it's important for us to realize that crying is okay. People say, well, she's sorry for crying. Well, it's like, well, no, it's you're letting us know that you're in a place of extra support, needing and deserving extra support on your journey. Journaling is another way of mourning. Emailing or texting someone you care about. Working with your hands, gardening, cooking. I know that after Kinslow died, I went and redid the entire backyard because it was one of the things that we love to do together. And as I was redoing the backyard, and because it had been left by itself for a number of years, as I was her primary caregiver, that came back into the garden and redid it. And I imagined her sitting there in her chair talking to me as I was gardening like we used to do. Cooking, playing sports, making bread, working in clay, singing. These all are ways that we mourn. Participating in a support group, seeking a counselor, making art. These are all tools that you need to take a look at and consider using, particularly if you're in anticipatory grief. So you have someone you can talk to that can listen to you, to be supportive of you, because it's the reality that our grief must be witnessed. And it gives us a chance and a space in which we can explore some of the feelings that we're having that we wouldn't necessarily take time to explore on our own, or have the freedom to be able to, or give ourselves that permission to take the time to do it. And so in a support group or seeking a counselor one-on-one can be very powerful. The bottom line is there's no right way to mourn. As long as you're expressing your grief outside and it feels helpful and cathartic to you, you're on the right track. So expressing your grief on the outside and it feels helpful and cathartic to you, you're on the right track. So that gives you some sense of measurement as you move along in your journey. So the 6 needs of mourning for anticipatory grief look like this. And this is where you're seeing some of the tools that you might use along the way here. Day by day, bit by bit, you must acknowledge that you are grieving and that the loss is coming. You first acknowledge this reality with your head, but over time, you'll come to acknowledge it with your heart. So again, it's a process. It's not something that you just wake up one day and get. It's something you ease into over the time. And that speed at which you ease into it, the speed at which you come to a point of acknowledgement, is very, very individual. You're strong enough to see and accept the facts of your circumstances. You're courageous enough to ask questions and to hear honest answers when you're unsure about the facts. So important for you to ask questions. so important for you to advocate for getting those answers that are on your heart and in your head, that not only you may have, but also the person you're caring for has. But the bottom line is you're strong enough to do this and courageous enough to stand up for yourself as you come to understand that this is your life. This is your partner's life, your spouse's life, your cousin's life, your husband's life. It's your life, and you have the right to understand have questions and have them answered, and that you're resilient enough to trust that you will indeed survive, because you will. I can say on the other side of it that I can, if you've lost hope, I can hold it for you. And we'll talk a little bit about hope here in our final slides in just a few minutes. But the idea is that sometimes it feels like hope is gone, when in fact, there are many people around you that can have hope, and they can share it with you as you are finding your way through your journey. So the second reconciliation need of mourning is, or anticipatory grief, is in coping with it, is if you find yourself avoiding the reality that you're confronted with, it's time to gently introduce yourself to the truth. And so if you're having trouble with accepting the reality, then it's important to talk to others who are knowledgeable about your situation and ask them to be straight with you and to tell you honestly what's going on. Share your thoughts and feelings about what is happening, no matter what they are. So realize that you have your natural and normal, the feelings you have, and they need to be expressed. And so find a venue, a format in which that can happen, either with other people, with like Kinslow and I would talk about it all the time, actually, how we were feeling, not 24/7, but it was always part of the conversation. So that if there are ambiguities or uncertainties, realize that that's okay, because there might be. Also, if you found yourself avoiding the reality that you're confronted with, how happened here? Okay. Number 2 is embracing and expressing feelings oftentimes softens them. So let them out, give them room, and they will soften, grow less powerful and all-consuming. You begin to see them for what they are, facets of love, or what you may be losing. It's a typo there. So naming and expressing your feelings softens them. Naming and expressing your feelings softens them. They feel big and they feel overwhelming, but as you name them and as you express them, they do soften over time. And that's how you know that you're integrating or begin to integrate the reality of what's happening. Explore the memories associated with the love or attachment you're losing. You're living in 3 time frames. Keep in mind and give yourself some grace here. Give yourself some self-compassion. So you're worried about the future, you're struggling with the present, and you're thinking about the past. So you're basically in 3 time frames. You've got to be really conscientious about where it is you want to be. And you can be in all 3 places in a day or in an hour. The idea is ultimately to be present and to be here and be here now, so that you can benefit from what this time has to offer in your relationship, and the things that you can talk about, the things that you can share with one another, the love that you can share with one another, the unfinished business that you can resolve. Number 4 is you develop a new self-identity. Who will I be after the loss? And that's something that is part of anticipatory grief and thinking about the future. Number 5 is search for meaning. This need is about exploring and finding a sense of meaning and purpose, both in the attachment that is ending and in your continued living. And I also would add from David Kessler as meaning in what they meant to you in your life, how they touched your life, how they impacted your life. I know with Kinslow, the 2 things that were big parts of the takeaway that I work on each day are grace and compassion. And so those are 2 qualities that she embodied in such a divinely beautiful way that I used those as, I don't know, I would say I use them as what I want to be, how I want to, expand those 2 qualities in my life. And number 6 is reach out for and accept support from others. Grief is an internal experience, an inner experience, as we've talked about. Mourning is, of course, outward, involves other people. So engage other people, find a support group that really does provide you with the support. Talk to the kind of people that will not judge you, but be present and allow you to speak, and not try and talk over you or tell you, or try to silver line or bright side or what it is that you're experiencing, or say, oh my gosh, you should be further along than that, or judge you. Find the people, find the tribe that's going to support you. So how do we live, love, and mourn at the same time? There was before and after, but right now you're in between. So transitional and liminal space, uncertain and stable and unsettling. And so part of it is finding a way to embrace that versus reject it. I know that it's hard. It's hard to do, but over the course of time, as you engage and understand that you're betwixt and between, you're in that liminal space, that you can actually find your center, or you can find a place where you can be at least a little comfortable part of the day with the fact that everything's changing. But you can be present by saying, hey, how are you today? What's on your heart? Let's talk about that. Let's make sure you get, your favorite meal today. Let's make sure we take our time and just be with each other. And that's why it's, be here now is such an, phrase you hear lots of, but this is so important at this time so that you can be present, spend your time fully in the now, and make constructive choices that allow you to be there and allow yourself also to know that you can dip into the past and talk about the past, the times you had together and how you got here, at the same time, not necessarily trying to live in the future, but there are times when you will. But in order for this to happen, to be able to live, love, and mourn at the same time, you have to set an intention daily. And that there's one thing you can control and decide how you're going to spend your time. So a kind of a daily refresh. How will you respond when things are not, things that are not planned happen? How do you decide to respond? Do you want to respond or do you want to react? Initially, we react with saying, no, that's not possible. I want to control it. Well, I can tell you that over the course of time, if you allow yourself to respond, take a moment, take a breath, take a pause, then you can respond in a way that allows you to be present to what is best in the moment. And so setting that intention daily is important. And then, of course, embrace allowing, relinquish your illusion of control and cultivate equanimity. And that comes through being mindful of being present. And that takes time, it takes practice, it takes daily attention, it takes attention by the moment sometimes. But that's part of how it is that we navigate with when we're in anticipatory grief. Caring for and loving someone who is dying, if that's what we're doing, we want to allow support and be present with loving kindness and compassion. And realizing that we have emotions. We may be angry and those need to be expressed too, maybe not to that person, maybe they do. And so you've got to determine how to go about that in a way that's constructive. We'll talk more about that in the subsequent sessions about how to do restorative expression when it comes to anger and guilt. Offer comfort and care and a listening ear. You're there to bear witness to their grief as well as your own, because you realize that you're grieving and so are they. And that was something that oftentimes, it's easy to get lost in our own grief and forget that that person that we're with, that we're caring for, is also grieving the loss of their health, the loss of the life that they thought they were going to have, the loss of the time they see in the future that they're not going to spend with you. Grief and love are simply two sides of the same coin. They go together. And when you bring your awareness and expression to both sides of them daily, you are living the fullness of life. So as loss happens, what do we do? This is something that really was important. We might be prepared, but we're never ready for loss. And, certainly 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks was a lot of preparation time for me. And as after Kinslow died, I went to see family. And one of my family members said, well, gee, you guys knew it was going to happen and you do this kind of work. So why are you so upset? And of course, at that point, I was like, I can't believe they even said that. But my response was, there's no question I was prepared. We spent a lot of time in preparation in the conversations, but you're never really ready. Would I have liked to have her for one more minute? Absolutely. As she lay in my arms, taking her last breath, would I like to have had that not be the case in that moment? Absolutely. So you might be prepared, and it's important to prepare. It's important to, engage in conversations like we are tonight, so that we have an opportunity to at least begin to feel and experience and explore. But keep in mind that it's for me, and I've heard many people talk about it, it's still a shock when it happens. You're still numb. You're still confused. I still found my keys in the freezer. I mean, I still didn't want to eat. I still didn't want to get out of bed. And I knew all that was, I prepared for it, but I wasn't ready for it. And I reached out for support, and that's important to do reach out for as the loss happens. You may feel dread as well as a mix of hope and relief. And of course, that's a very natural part of it. There was absolute relief that she no longer was suffering. And there was, there's no question. So relief is part of and then, it's a time too that you're cracked open. You really are brokenhearted. And in that brokenness, however, comes your intuitive knowledge that you have all the tools that you need. They may not have been used. They may be yet to be discovered, but the tools exist. You have a skill set, and that you've been building that skill set and to help you cope with the loss as it happens, and of course to grieve and to mourn authentically afterwards. So make sure you give yourself some space and really exercise and work with self-compassion if that's not your thing, and realize that whatever your tendencies are and how you've dealt with events in your life are oftentimes the way you'll do this as well. And so you may be learning things about yourself you never knew, but they're there. This skill set, we are wired to grieve. We're wired to be on this journey because it's such an intimate part of our life. After the loss, the death ends a life, not the relationship. David Kessler talks about it in the form of the love never dies. And my relationship with Kenzo continues. She'll always be in my heart, and she'll always be part of my life. Grief softens and changes over time as we actively mourn. That's true. The intensity of it and the heaviness on the chest and the wrenching of the gut, those all take time, but they take time. The time they take is proportional to the amount of time you're willing to mourn and actively engage in mourning. That takes time. That follows, as you continue to acknowledge the loss and the reality of the fact that they're no longer here in the physical form, but they'll always be in your heart. At some point in time, as David Kessler says, this is so beautiful. At some point in time, we remember them with more love than pain. At some point in time, our grief bursts wind up becoming love bursts. They're reminders of the love we shared. And that takes place at some point. Not sure when. It's different for everybody, but it's important to give ourselves the freedom to experience it as it comes to us. Active mourning help us begin to reconcile our grief, a reconciliation of the reality and the finality of the physical loss, and a return to stable eating and sleeping patterns over the course of time. But again, no timeline. There's no time. Dr. Wolfelt puts in the form of saying there's no reward for speed here. No reward for speed. It just simply takes the time it takes. Active mourning help us begin to have the capacity to live a full life without feelings of guilt, the lack of self-respect, and also an adjustment to a new role or change that have resulted from the loss. As we're cracked open, we're also redefining who we are in the world, and that we might be learning something very interesting about ourselves we didn't know from before. So that takes time to unfold and adjust. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross puts it this way: the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss. You will learn to live with it. You will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you'll never be the same, nor should you be, nor would you want to. Final word from Dr. Wolfelt has to do with hope. Hope is an expectation of good that is yet to be. The secret is that hope is more than a feeling. It is an action and a practice. So take a moment to ask yourself what makes you feel hopeful. This is the kind of questions you ask yourself after the loss. What or who gives you that buoyant sense that things can be good again, that there are things to look forward to in life? And then whatever your answer is to those questions, at least one of them belongs on your schedule each and every day. Spend 5 minutes doing one thing that reminds you that your life offers happiness and connection. I hope you will mourn actively and live and love deeply. Godspeed, Dr. Alan Wolfelt. This is what we based everything on tonight. We came from this book and other sources, David Kessler, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Megan Devine, as well as Brene Brown. But the fundamental content of this came from this book, Expected Loss, Coping with Anticipatory Grief. It's $9.95, I think, at the Center for Loss and Life Transition at the centerforloss.com. I've received no financial remuneration for talking about Dr. Wolfelt's work. But it's there for you if you want to dive deeper into. There's much more in the book than I covered, of course, in the time we have, but I want to make sure that you can dive into it deeper if you like. And one of those books that's small, and I'll show you the size of it. You can see it on screen a little bit there, but this book, it's very small. It's kind of like a pocket size. It's one of those things you can have handy and keep with you and refer to and look at. I mean, I think I've expended an entire pen's worth of ink on in these books, each book. So there's more to this topic and the content you'll find in the book. So questions, thoughts, conversation?
Garrick, I just want to thank you so much for your elegant presentation this evening. This is just so beautifully put, and quoting some of my heroes in this work. I'm grateful to you.
Mine too.
And I'll just introduce myself here. Elijah mentioned me at the beginning, but I have the great good luck to work with Elijah at Mission Hospice. I'm Christine Kovach, and I'm the Bereavement Services Manager at Mission in San Mateo. And Garrick is inviting conversation now, and I'm here to be part of that conversation as well. I see that Doris has a hand up, and then we have kind of the rest of our time together until 8 o'clock to share reactions, what thoughts came up. I took some notes about things that sort of bubbled up for me as you were talking, and you used one of my favorite graphics of all time. That growing around grief graphic is so meaningful to me. So I'm just going to start with that observation, that those jars, like at the beginning of grief takes up the whole space. And we think that grief is going to get smaller, smaller, smaller. But maybe what happens is that the grief stays, and we grow our capacity to hold it, to endure it. We grow our lives bigger around it. That graphic is very powerful one. So thank you for including that, Garrick.
You bet.
Let's invite Doris. You have your hand up, and then I may insert some of my thoughts too as things that I jotted down.
Sure.
Go ahead, Doris.
Hi, thank you. First of all of you, thank you for doing this. And Garrick, we go back a little bit. So I want to thank you for being here, for me, allowing me to be here. I'm having trouble right now. I've gone through various losses in the sense of a calm, quiet loss, 3-day anticipation of my mother. I only had her for 3 days. I did not have the chance to really go through the anticipatory because it was that quick. A sudden tragic loss of my granddaughter several years ago in a horrific accident in California that took 34 lives. And what's happening right now is I'm going through anticipatory for my 97-year-old husband. And in the next 3 weeks is my granddaughter's birthday, death day. And Garrick, my heart is with you today, and may it be a peaceful day for you. I hope you know how I feel regarding your wife. What's happening, though, to me with this anticipatory, we learn about grieving one at a time. And as her dates are coming up, my body is responding first, then being aware, of course, that the dates are coming up. And my husband and I were blessed to have her for 26 years in our life. So lately, what he's talking about, Garrick, when you said about talking about things and just loving each other and sharing things, he's the only one that's around to talk about Allie. That's my granddaughter's name, Alexandra Allie. And I think my anticipatory is twofold. He's much older and he's got some serious illnesses. I won't just lose him. I will lose my connection, my only connection that knew her. And he's talking about her a lot. So I will lose that as well. And sometimes when I'm his caregiver, I find that I'm not thinking of Allie. And then I think, oh my God, you know, I need to, it's too new still with her. But yet it's him. It's different for my family that I've lost. Those I have time and I can separate. This for me right now is so new that it's difficult because there's the scare, there's all the feelings, everything. I've also been blessed to be part of David Kessler's group and take his course. But this is very, very new to me because I'll be losing several things. That communication.
I'm wondering, Doris, if it might be worth considering recording the conversation that you and your husband are having around Allie. And that you actually kind of maybe interview him about what he loved about her, what he respected and cherished about her.
That's what he's been sharing. He was interviewed by someone who's doing a master's and was bringing up, because I'm not going to spend the time here, lots and lots, detail. And what's interesting, he already has some dementia, but yet every single detail he's bringing up. And I remember what you wore, that everything. That is a wonderful idea. Thank you, Garrick.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. It's overwhelming because this is so new to me now. So new. And as you know, the date's coming up. The body knows before we do.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and you plan for the
birthday's coming up too.
Yeah, and then make a plan for maybe celebrating her birthday, the two of you, and get some Zoom activity going for people who knew her friends, because I know you've talked about
That's
her
it. There's no,
friends.
they're all in Europe. They're all over.
Yeah.
See, there aren't. That's why I said about
I wondered if you could put out the message that, hey, we're going to have a celebration around, because we've done this for Kinslow, where we tell everyone, her friends and family, that we're having a celebration and Zoom meeting. Everybody gets on and has a conversation. And
unfortunately, Garrick, there's two friends. That's it.
Yeah. Well,
No
those
family, no nothing. But they're in India. They're,
two friends about our two friends that are there. So that might be something to consider.
Yeah. But unfortunately, there's no, we'll go to her bench. There's no grave, there's nothing there, go to the bench. The others, I was okay. They were hard, but it was okay. This one's a little bit different. And it's a big birthday.
Yeah. Big birthday.
It's a big birthday, 30. That's like, So I thank you. And what you said is so true. Thank you for allowing me to be witnessed with my feelings, because that's what it's all about. And I thank you.
Much love. Yeah. Much love to you, Doris. Thanks for being
here.
here.
Thank you, Garrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Some other things that occurred to me while you were talking about anticipatory grief, that this grief doesn't start when someone dies, right? It starts when we can begin to imagine someone we love gone. And in that imagination, there can be fear, anxiety. There's all the unknown, right? That can be so much a part of what people are grappling with in anticipatory grief. How in the world is this going to be? How is this illness going to play out? How am I going to cope with it? What will life be like afterwards? That unknown and fear really struck me as you were talking.
An expression of those fears is how they soften. I just simply, we express the fear and we can look at it and experience it in a different way because we're giving a voice to it. And that leads us to, being able to see things and to experience the feeling in a different way. I mean, if we keep it to ourselves, it kind of has a tendency to, fester, to bubble over and may not, without expression, it winds up being unfelt, and therefore, it overshadows our experience. So it's important to express the fear, to explore the fear, to kind of lean into it a little bit.
Absolutely. So many of you talked about, in the city, I see you, so we'll come to you in just a minute, but so many of you talked about caring for those with cancer or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And it's not one big loss that you're anticipating, right? It's all the parts of the loss that happen along the way. And each one is fresh and intense and heartbreaking. So I just want to acknowledge that it's lots of losses along the way. Yeah. Cindy, please. And you're muted if you
Yeah, there we go. I couldn't find the icon to raise my hand, so thank you for, I just first want to thank you, Garrick, for your very thoughtful and compassionate and empathetic presentation. It was really very sweet and very, very helpful, very helpful. I just wanted to say out loud for myself that I was my husband's caregiver for about 3.5 years. He passed away from idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So breathing was his issue. But his mind was completely alert. So for that, I'm very grateful. But what I'm struggling with in my grief is that we didn't use that time to recognize the end was coming, because he was fighting so hard to not surrender and not let the disease win, until all of a sudden he said, "I'm done, I can't do this anymore." And it was literally like 2 days, almost just barely 2 days. And then it was over. So now I'm left with, working through my grief in terms of, wow, I should have been planning. I should have. So your next series on guilt, I will be there. But it's just amazing to me how we didn't do that. We didn't have those conversations. We did kind of planning, but not like I thought it was going to be. So I'm just working through that. And thank you for letting me say that out loud.
One of the things I find in those moments where there's that sense of woulda, shoulda, coulda, that it's something that our mind can kind of run rampant around.
Oh,
really
yeah.
Just beat the stuffing out of us. I mean,
yeah, I'm real good at that.
It's almost like feeling like, my mind is terrorizing me and I've got to say, stop.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Right.
This is not the truth. The truth is that we didn't plan, but we did exactly what it is that we needed to do in that moment.
Right.
That was then, and this is now. And even if I was to plan, wouldn't necessarily change the outcome. And so there's that sense in the back of our mind that if we had planned, well, goodness, he would live for much longer.
Right.
or wouldn't have had the disease, or whatever it is that we're making up in our mind to try and continue to mentally move ourselves through that. And sometimes being present to the fact that we're just not being fair to ourselves. Allow ourselves to be present with the fact that the truth is that we did our best.
Right.
We did our absolute best. And I
I do feel that. I do feel that we did our best. I did my best.
Right.
So it's just, well, my mind is terrorizing me. That's exactly, not all the time, anymore,
no.
but my husband's been gone for 7 months, but so, maybe only 20 hours a day.
Yeah, right, of course.
Instead of 24.
Right. So you're making
I'm making progress.
Yeah.
Right.
How long has your husband been gone?
Almost 7 months.
Oh my goodness, Cindy.
Yeah.
In grief time, that's kind of like yesterday.
I know. Yeah.
Really. I mean, honestly, grief time, it's like maybe even a few hours ago, much less than yesterday.
That's how it feels, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And that's part of it too, is that this happens in your own time, your own way, at your own pace, and it's important. There's no timeline, but there's that desire to trying to regain control of something that's not controllable.
Right.
So mind says, well, you could have done this, you should have done that. Why didn't you do this? Bad on you. Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, wait a minute, timeout. You need to have a timeout. You need to have a timeout. And you need to sit over here, take a rest, take a breath, and let's the heart speak as to what's underneath that, which is you're still, it's the raw grief. It's hard work. I mean, it's heart work, which makes it hard work.
Right.
So it's a lot of self-compassion here, a lot of whatever it is that you do for self-care. And Rip talks about self-care for the caregiver is so important. After the death is just as important that you give yourself the latitude and the time to say, well, gee whiz, I'm going to take a moment. I'm not going to terrorize myself. I'm just going to let my mind have a moment itself, maybe in the corner. I don't know, but just a time out, because I'm going to go smell the roses. I'm going to go take a walk. I'm going to go do something that's good for me. So be good to
Thank
yourself.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think you just reminding me, Cindy, about maybe we all have sort of an ideal fantasy of how that time could be when someone is ill, and it'll unfold in this kind of spacious way, and we'll have all the time for just all the conversations to happen in this elegant, perfect way. And in fact, sometimes, the illness, the caregiving, the symptoms, all of it is just unfolding in a totally unexpected way, and you're just hanging on for the ride, right? And doing the best you can. And you're getting through it, right? And the fantasy of how it could be just isn't even possible. That just happens sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
One day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And be good to yourself.
I'm working on that.
Yeah.
I'm making progress on that. I really am.
And you also have to sometimes take a look at are you a person that is good to yourself? Have you been good to yourself in the past?
No.
Right. So
little workhorse here.
Yeah. So it's like you're writing character in some respects. So that's part of the breaking open and able to see ourselves in a different way and saying, oh, I see where that tendency, that's what I've been doing. And I can make a different decision. I can look at this from a different point of view. This is giving me a perspective because my attention I've been broken open in such a way that I can't help but see that I might not want to do that in the future. I may want to take that bubble bath. I may want to eat that pint of ice cream or go to that movie or take that vacation or whatever it is that's good self-care for you.
Right.
So.
No, that's such a good point. One of you mentioned in the chat about um, having some pleasure, some in your days, and then feeling guilty about that afterwards.
Sure.
Um, and I think that whether you're in the midst of caregiving or in the midst of grieving after a loss, that you are allowed to have grief breaks.
Mhm.
Right. And it's so intense that if there is a way, like some of the things Garrick's suggesting, if there's a way to step out just for a minute and just like, I just need to be in another space, can be so helpful. Sometimes parents who have young children will be worried that their children aren't doing their grief right because the kids have a limited capacity for the intensity. You know, they can be sad and cry and they can be right in there with the grief and then got to go play, you know, and the parents worry, are they doing it right? Is there, you know, is there something wrong with that? And I think what a blessing that the kids may know when their capacity is full,
Yeah.
right? And now I need a break.
Right.
If adults could follow that model, like, oh, I'm at capacity, I gotta have a break. It's really powerful.
We just experienced that last night with my grandson. He said, "I'm so sad that Grandpa died." And then he paused and then he said, "Can I have my ice cream?"
Yeah.
You know, it was like we kind of laughed. It was like, that is really cute. But yeah, so, you know, but it's like these thoughts are there, we know, because they bring it up and then, you know, they switch. It was really sweet though.
And what a beautiful thing we do too. We have the opportunity to model grieving for
Mhm.
our kids and our grandkids and our great grands. You know, they have a chance to see us do it authentically in a way that allows expression and allows that expression to be okay and to talk about and to be able to not necessarily stuff it away, but that they say, well, you know, he has the freedom now. He's had the freedom, obviously. You've given him the freedom and encouraged him to say what's on his heart. And, you know, he did. And then, you know, it's time for ice cream. Come on, let's get to it. So beautiful. What's your husband's name?
Dennis.
Dennis. Dennis, beautiful. Thank you for sharing him with us.
Thank you.
Their thoughts are coming up for folks. Reactions, observations. I had another one that just kind of emerged as I was listening to you, Garrick, about just the thought that acknowledging anticipatory grief when someone is ill and you're caregiving or you're observing their decline, that acknowledging that grief is not a betrayal. It is natural, right? It just is. It doesn't mean that you've given up hope or that you've given up on the person. It's just this sort of natural human imagining that comes up.
It's important too that we, you know, give ourselves it's important for us to have a file to put this in. And as a caregiver, you're oftentimes so focused on giving and caregiving that you have these feelings, but you're not really sure what they are, but you really haven't got time to deal with them. And I did some work with a group of caregivers, primarily dealing with as caregivers for people with Alzheimer's, dementia. And I was amazed at how many of them stated that now I know what it is that I'm feeling. Now that I have something to say, oh, that's what that is. There was a kind of big sigh in the room, if you will, where people say, oh gosh, now I know what that is. And it made a difference because being able to put something in perspective in a time of chaos, it can be very, very rewarding, very helpful in giving us the perspective we need in a time of chaos. So naming it is, and it's not a grief that's talked about. I mean, I'm talking to more and more palliative care docs about the fact that, our oncologists, when you're delivering the diagnosis, also provide an opportunity for support to be given, and support in the form of having, groups created around supporting people who are in anticipatory grief. And so that educational process is beginning to happen, and it's part of the palliative care list of tools they have available to them, because it's real. It happens.
I appreciated your invitations for creativity as well.
Yeah.
I think writing and art can be so powerful, sometimes beyond, you can get to places that you can't even get to with talking.
Yeah.
Right. It's really deep work.
Kind of sometimes. I was in Italy this past March, and spent time in the Sistine Chapel and the Vatican and so forth, and heard many stories about Michelangelo and how Michelangelo actually approached what he was doing. And it was that way. It was just simply allowing it to come to him as to what it was that he was to do, and basically what parts of the marble were to be taken away to reveal the figure underneath. And so it's important for us to know that that's true for us. Is like, it's allowing us to have the experience, inviting the experience, and not being, well, being as whatever we are, but at the same time allowing ourselves to have the experience and to see it for what it is. You put a name to it. Yeah.
There's
creativity. That creativity bypasses the conscious mind and allows us to see things from a whole different perspective. It's not just cheddar. There's something else that we're connecting with within ourselves, our intuition, our soul, who we are, whatever it is that you use, to define that part of you. But art, poetry, kind of bypass that. Well, is that really good enough? You don't think that line should be over here? I mean, that kind of stuff that goes on when our mind's engaged.
There's another wise grief educator, researcher, Ken Doka, you may know. Yeah, and he talks about, he uses the phrases intuitive and instrumental grievers, like intuitive being the ones who are the emoters, people who easily share about their feelings, they cry, they express. Therapists love that. We know what to do with that. Instrumental grievers are the doers, just as legitimate to be doing something that's a creative or a task oriented, tribute sometimes, as another way of working with grief. I think that art and creation falls kind of in that category. Mm-hmm. We all fall somewhere on that continuum of emoters and doers.
Yeah. And there's a big difference between how men grieve and how women grieve. Mm-hmm. Women, more comfortable with talking, and it's in the DNA as to how that came about in today's form. But men are been told in this society they're protectors and providers, and of course you can't cry, you can't be vulnerable, you got to be on your game if you're going to be a protector and provider. So no tears, get back to business. The men grieve. More men visit grave sites more often than women, because it's publicly the only place they're really allowed to grieve openly.
Wow.
So there's there's the differences. So just a thought.
That's an important thought. Actually, yeah. I'm trying to figure out my role in my adult son and the grief he's going through, because he has actually said to me he did have an experience where he cried really cried, he told me, for like 2 hours. And I thought, oh, wow, that's so good. I'm so happy to hear that. And then kind of in the next hour, he said, well, I can't really cry. I really can't cry. You know, I'm the provider, I'm the protector. And yeah, you know, it's just what you just said. So I'm trying to, well, what is my role in helping him, if I have any role, which as his mother, I feel like I do, but you know, it's an interesting, it's very different.
Yeah, and the roles that we play with one another and family in particular is how it is that we're doing our grief.
Right.
We're modeling that for our children, whether they're grown or not. There's still that relationship. I mean, my mother's 91 years old and I'm still her favorite child, even though I have a sister, but I'm still the favorite child. But my sister would disagree.
Right.
But nonetheless, you know, it's just, you still have that relationship with your mom. It's primal. It is what it is. And it's tragic when they die. So, but my point is that you still are in the role of modeling.
Right.
So, you know, tending to your own grief is so important, and honoring and respecting how they're grieving, and whether he cried or didn't cry is really kind of okay. And that's how he's finding his way. And if he's asking for support, then of course, you know, you engage in a conversation, but not giving direction and giving him the space to be able to experience this. And men oftentimes grieve side by side. They don't grieve one-on-one. You know, when you want to grieve with the guy, when you want to talk about grief, you go work on the car. You go work cutting down a tree.
Right.
You know, the old adage is the wife is on the phone to the therapist saying, "Hey, my husband hasn't cried yet. It's been 6 months since his mother died. He hasn't cried at all." And the therapist says, "Well, what is he doing right now?" He says, "Well, he's in the back cutting down a tree." The therapist says, "Well, sounds like he's doing a good job."
Yeah.
Right.
That's good.
Where, you know, the tendency is we fix things and we do things, and then the guys go on a fishing trip and one of their buddies has died. And they come back and the wife asks, "Well, how was it?" And she's of course all interested. "What did you guys talk about? Did you talk about Ben?" "No,
No,
not really. No, we just fished. Yeah, just fished." And they may have talked about, times when they, got drunk together and did this or that. But did you talk about Ben and how you felt about Ben? No.
No. Yeah.
But they were companions to each other.
Exactly.
In the experience, right? It's
And
just done a different way.
I did want to interject just one resource. There's a group called the Dinner Party, and it's a nonprofit that actually focuses on supporting 21 to 45-year-olds who've lost a sibling, a parent, a child. It's anyone in their close network, in their close orbit, that they've had a relationship that's ended through death. It could be that maybe he's not grieving out loud to you, but he's still looking for that sense of community. And I know when I had my first big loss, it was easier for me to talk to strangers. So I actually found this group and went and just kind of sat and listened. And this was in person, so I ate with them and we all just shared our own story. And then I walked out and, I could say whatever I want and nobody could repeat it back to me. So that was the beauty of finding this community, very separate from my own daily support network. So that might be a good resource for him as well.
Thank you.
Good one, Elijah. Thank you. Young people kind of envisioning how to create grief support in a new way.
Right.
Brilliant, really. Oh, good. You put it in the chat.
Thank you. That's great. Dinnerparty.org.
Any kind of last comments or thoughts, musings? I'm just so grateful for all of you to join us this evening. This has really been special, and for your willingness to share your losses, share what's on your heart, willing to be
Margaret,
vulnerable.
did you want to share before we go?
I completely forgot to tune in. Would it be, is a recording available?
So I'll be sure to send out a follow-up email, and I could put any of the resources shared tonight, the links, the videos. I'll take a day or two and pull all of the things we talked about together. And then the
Okay.
recording itself would be available in about a week or so. And I can do
Okay.
an email and make sure everyone gets that as well. But thank you for tuning in when you did. And we
Yeah,
still
I
have
was,
sessions in this series, so you're welcome to join either of those.
oh, thank you. I was really looking forward to it and I completely
Don't
forgot.
worry, we gotcha. Yeah, a lot of people watch the recordings after and, twice even if they need to hear the information a couple of times.
Oh,
I'll be
great,
sure that
thank you.
everyone gets all of that.
So perfect timing, in other words.
Yeah.
Perfect timing. Oh, Garrick, I'm so grateful that you're here with us this evening and that you're coming back. You have two
Coming back.
more really special presentations for us, one in August and one in September.
Yes, and I think it's in the chat if you want to register, they're free. And we'll talk about the guilt of grief and the anger of grief. I think we're talking about the anger of grief, guilt of grief first, which is next month. Is that right? Next
Yes.
in
So
August.
have it written down somewhere here. August 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time will be our next program, and that will be the guilt of grief. And then the month following September will be the anger of grief. And those are
Yeah.
all in that link there. So you're more than welcome to tune in, and I'll send those materials out afterwards as well.
Yeah. Invite your
Great.
friends.
Please invite your community and your loved ones and anyone who you think you want to share this space with. And then afterwards, I think it's a good way to prompt conversation as well of, oh, do you remember this point that, Garrick pointed out, or this thing that Christine brought up? So I think this is a good way to start conversation as well. And I wanted to take a moment before we sign off to thank Garrick and Christine for sharing their amazing wisdom and resources and just creating this sacred space for everyone to feel so comfortable putting their stories in the chat and saying their stories out loud. And thank you all for being here as well. I hope you'll join us next month.
Thank you.